Hamatakapi, this is Nick Estes, co-host of the Red Nation podcast. We have two special guests today, two people that I've been wanting to have on the podcast for a while. We have Chris Gilbert and Cira Pascual, both of whom are currently in Venezuela, which we'll get to in a moment. But today, the topic that we're discussing is this larger question has been sort of floating around the anti-imperialist left around whether the revolution, the Bolivarian Revolution, has been betrayed, whether its leadership is traitorous. These are words that have been used by online commentators from the global north. And we'll get into that, but I wanted to just do a quick rundown of what has happened so far, especially under the Trump administration. I don't want to short shrift the revolution to just one U.S. presidency, because this has been a 27-year process. And I always want to remind people that's 27 years out of 500 years of undoing, centuries of colonialism, of exploitation, and genocide, as well as, just really subverting the popular sovereignty of people within the Western Hemisphere in the Americas. But I think this really, the story that we should start talking about is, in this current moment, is looking at the Shield of Americas and how the United States brought together this so-called counter cartel coalition with its stated objective to combat narco-terrorism. But this is really just a hybridization of the war on terror and the war on drugs. Used to justify the military targeting of civilians, to isolate and to overthrow progressive and revolutionary governments. But I think more importantly is to counter Chinese economic and political influence in the Western Hemisphere. This coalition represents a group of right-wing actors. It purports to represent all of the Americas, but it only has, I think, 1/3 of all the countries. There's ongoing active military operations. There's Operation Southern Spear. There's Operation Absolute Resolve, Operation Total Extermination, which involves drone strikes, naval blockades, and the reactivation of military bases, and the targeted overthrow and kidnapping of foreign leaders, such as the elected president, Nicolás Maduro, and first combatant Cilia Flores. There's also a militarization of the Caribbean that is currently taking place in the U.S. military colony of Puerto Rico. There's also the focus on Cuba. As those who live in the United States know, Cuba's in the news. The targeting of the 94-year-old Raul Castro as somebody, as a figure of the Castro, as what the United States calls the Castro regime, but also an important figure in the Cuban Revolution. And this has been a very deadly military campaign and operation. There's been over about 200 people killed in 58 strikes and drone strikes in the Caribbean, and some in the Pacific. There have been 58 U.S. airstrikes conducted under Operation Southern Spear. We also have, the mass murder of about 100 people in Venezuela during Operation Absolute Resolve, which was the illegal abduction of Nicolás Maduro and the attack on Cilia Flores, both of whom are held in the Metro Detention Center in New York City right now, awaiting charges that seem to be changing day by day, because the United States has declared them both part of a foreign domestic terrorist organization that the United States now admits doesn't exist, the cartel of the Suns. So this is kind of where we're at, I think, in the imperialist attack on specifically Venezuela, but also putting it into a geopolitical context. And I want to talk a little bit about my own experience before I ask Cira and Chris to weigh in here. But I've been to Venezuela several times. I remember going to the southern state of Bolivar for an indigenous conference that was held there, and learning specifically about the indigenous role in the Bolivarian Revolution, the codification of indigenous rights and representation within the Constitution. And one thing that I learned more recently, when we had a federal occupation here in Minneapolis, was the groups that were formed in response to the community defense networks that were formed in response to the federal attack, which resulted in the killing of 3 people and the shooting of others, was that you don't report anything unless you see it with your own eyes, because of the massive amounts of misinformation and propaganda that was being purported. And I take that to heart, especially thinking about what I witnessed with my own eyes when I was in Venezuela, meeting with Chavistas, meeting with popular sectors, also meeting with critics of the revolution as well, and listening to all of those stories, all of the perspective experiences, the aspirations of what people were going through. And especially in this moment when we're so bombarded. I think the United States is the most propagandized country in the world. We're so bombarded with misinformation, disinformation, fake news, psychological operations. We had a whole episode on what that looked like, and what that looks like and the implications of it. But I think in this moment in time, the effect of the abduction, the illegal abduction, and taking out of Maduro in this moment hasn't been to unite the solidarity movement. Ironically, it has been to divide the solidarity movement. And I'm only speaking from the perspective of, from where I'm sitting. I'm not speaking of what's happening on the ground in Venezuela. We'll get to that in a moment. But it's confused, it's divided the solidarity movement, I think, in really destructive ways. And so I think that needs to be taken into account. And like, how did we get here? And I always go back to what we learned during Operation Metro Surge here, was that you only report on what you see. And I feel that some of the reporting that's been happening and the commentary that's been happening in the global north isn't based on eyewitness experiences, on the ground experiences, but has been based on secondhand information, or perhaps what we might call writing the algorithm and trying to get clicks and hot takes. So without further ado, I do want to move on to our guests, Chris and Cira, and maybe we can just start by maybe responding to what I just laid out, but also just giving us a sense of what is happening today and right now on the ground. What are the feelings around the sort of accusations that the revolution has been betrayed, or perhaps the revolution's leadership is somehow traitorous?
So a little bit about how things are here on the ground, and then some reflections that this will take on as well. And thank you very much for this space. It's very important for us from here in Venezuela to have, voices from connected with the grassroots, with the people who are building a new world in the communes and in other spaces of popular power, to have it be heard in the global north, because imperialism, its attacks can come in many forms, from, of course, overt war and the kidnapping of a president, economic war, which is more than 10 years old against the people of Venezuela, and which only in 2 years killed about 40,000 people approximately. And of course, all the coups and coup attempts and fascist actions in the streets of Caracas. But yes, I think that having contextualized it, as you well did, 27 years of a struggle, 27 years learning, and of the people learning in their assemblies, how is the situation here right now? This goes to revert basically the other leg of imperialist action, which is psyops. And very quickly after January 3rd, the first media that said that there might have been treason was mainstream media. It didn't come from here. It didn't come from the left in the global north. It actually came from mainstream media, kind of like hinting in that direction. And I think that should be centered when we understand the current situation, and then later, unfortunately, how some of that left has incorporated that imperialist discourse in their analysis of Venezuela. It is important to say here that among Chavista bases, it is clear, on the one hand, it was clear since the beginning that there was unity within the government after January 3rd, which was very important for us to see it on January 3rd in the afternoon, to see Delcy Rodriguez and the whole high command, military and political high command. And there haven't been any ruptures within the political military leadership of the process of the revolution. And then to the people, going to the people, it is, of course, everybody probably has heard that there were marches with hundreds of thousands of people following the attacks in unity, in defense of the government, of course, calling for the immediate release of the president who is kidnapped and the Primera Combatiente, but also in very clearly anti-imperialist marches. Those were the days following, in a total show of unity between the people and the government. Now, of course, 5 months have happened already since then, since the 3rd. And what we can see amongst the people of Venezuela, the Chavista bases, and of course in Venezuela, not everybody is Chavista, but amongst the Chavista bases, and really, anybody to say that this is not the case with some facts, with some evidence, there hasn't been a rupture with the government. This is a new situation. The kind of like long history of aggressions is not new, but January 3rd marks a new situation because not only our president was kidnapped, but I think that's something that people oftentimes avoid centering in the discussion is that there was, and there still is, a naval siege on Venezuela. So already by late December, Venezuela could not take out any of its oil because of the imperialist siege, and that imperialist siege remains. Since then, Venezuela has to make one massive concession to U.S. imperialism, which is that the commercialization of oil is being done by the United States. This is a tremendous blow. And this is what should be denounced first and foremost by anti-imperialists. Then people should be looking at what people are seeing on the ground, what people are saying on the ground. And if you go to an assembly in a commune, you will hear people, of course, making criticisms of the government, as would have been the case a year ago. The people who are with their government are not thinking. People sometimes have criticisms of the government, but you will not see these ruptures with the Venezuelan government. And I think that is super important to highlight. I think I will leave it there, and I will pass it on to Chris, and then we can continue with the conversation.
Sure. I wanted to say, I think you're absolutely right, Nick, to begin with the question of imperialism and the new modality of imperialism we're in. It certainly does seem to be a more aggressive form of imperialism in our region. Cira and I often say they've crossed red lines that haven't been crossed before, though that's arguable. I can kind of talk to some of the subtleties of that point and how some of them actually were crossed before. But I think that the idea of hyper-imperialism that was developed by the Tricontinental Institute is relevant for understanding what's going on. Part of the hyper-imperialist idea is that imperialism right now is U.S. imperialism, which is the center of world imperialism, the center of the only Europe imperialist bloc in the world, is entering a phase in which it's both weakened and more dangerous. And it's weakened and more dangerous because of the five the five things that imperialism tries to control. It really has control of the military part and the informational part, whereas resources and science and technology and financial flows are kind of slipping out of its grip. So that means they play the military card even more strongly, and they try to control the narrative even more strongly. And that's what we've seen happening in our region. There's also a geographic shift because U.S. imperialism got a kind of comeuppance in the past year or so when Trump tried to impose these radical tariffs on China, and China responded by restricting the rare earth metal flow. And then the U.S. essentially wanted to change the field of struggle to Latin America. China remains its principal enemy, but it's trying to carry out that struggle in our region. So all of these steps, whether it's attack on Venezuela, the formation of the Shield of the Americas, the other things that you mentioned, I think they're part of this general recolonizing objective that Marco Rubio talked about explicitly in Munich, and it's especially focused on our region. And I think that it's true that generally we've been taken a bit off unprepared by this. We shouldn't be entirely unprepared. And the sense in which imperialism has crossed some of these red lines previously is precisely in Colombia. Like, it's become a commonplace to say that this is the first time that the U.S. has actually done an invasion of South America. It invaded Central America, Panama specifically in 1989. But this is maybe the first time it did an invasion of South America. But that's not entirely true if you look at Colombia. The U.S. has 7 military bases in Colombia. The U.S. military has essentially been there. And it was doing targeted operations against the Colombian guerrilla during the previous decade. And that's precisely what turned the tables, what caused the FARC to make important concessions and enter into the peace process. And that peace process for the FARC, which was the principal guerrilla in Colombia, might have some analogies with what Venezuela is going through today. So it's not entirely untraveled territory. And in terms of self-critique, we could criticize ourselves for not taking into account that history enough, for not realizing they had that military advantage already, and they could have employed it, and they were going to apply it eventually. So Obama had been doing drone operations in West Asia for a long time, targeted assassinations completely outside of any legal framework or any kind of international consensus. And it was only a matter of time, I think, before they decided to apply those same tactics in Latin America, which is what they've been doing in the past couple of years explicitly, though they were doing it in Colombia maybe as much as 15 or almost 15, 17 years ago. But the thing I always want to emphasize with the Venezuelan situation, is that there is something here. You mentioned the 27 years. Those are 27 years of revolution. And I often think that people don't even have conceptual framework for a revolution. It's almost a simple fact that normal forms of historiography, to say nothing of news reporting, have no space for the idea of revolution, precisely because a revolution is an extraordinary thing. It steps out of the ordinary framework of things. But a revolution involves profound changes in a society, and it's really not going to be taken apart. It's not going to collapse or be defeated by simply taking one leader if it's a real revolution. So I think that this is a real revolution which produced over 27 years, not 4 months, not 4 years, but 27 years. It produced profound changes in society, which are expressed, I think, of the main pillars of the revolutionist army, the patriotic army, which is always important in the national liberation process. In this case, we talk about the civic military alliance, which is a reality. And then there's the party, the Socialist Party. And then there's also social organizations like the communes being the most vanguardist proposal, which is actually the building block of socialism. So when people talk about betrayal, when they jump to the gun and start talking about betrayal, I think they've denied from the beginning, essentially a priori, they're saying there's no revolution here. Because how could there be a betrayal if all these things remain intact? If there was really a betrayal, they would have to really work hard and start taking apart the patriotic army, start changing the name of the party, changing the program of the party. They would have to start taking apart the communes, and they're not doing any of that. So that's where you have these Western thinkers, not all of them, but many of the Western, including left, including allegedly anti-imperialist thinkers, who adopt this rather commonplace narrative that was adopted by Trotskyism, by saying the revolution betrayed, always looking for a betrayal, always denying that a revolution, people who are revolutionaries from the armchair think of a revolution as something that has to be perfect. It has to happen in a space of perfection. It doesn't confront real obstacles, and that's one reason it can be perfect. And they also believe it has to go in a straight line. There can't be any changes or reorientations. And every revolution that survived has done reorientations, whether it's the Cuban Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, has done important reorientations in its strategic architecture or planning. And I believe that's what Venezuela is doing right now. And it's a very sad, though perhaps somewhat predictable, to see people, certain sector of the intellectual class, unwilling to allow for that space of movement, unwilling to trust. I think there's an element of white supremacism or racism in that, unwilling to imagine that the leadership could be developing a strategic plan because they think they are the only ones who manage strategy and they have the strategy in their hands. So I'm convinced there hasn't been a betrayal here. I am convinced we're facing a complicated situation for precisely the new imperialist scenario, which affects all of Latin America, Cuba, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, all of our progressive countries. And we have to confront it together and develop a strategy. And everything points over the last 27 years that it's important to maintain the unity of Chavismo, to maintain that unity between base and leadership. And the leadership now is embodied by Delcy Rodriguez.
Yeah, thank you so much for those perspectives. And this is kind of a question that's building off of things that you both said, because I think it's important to understand what the nature of the state is. And this was a debate that I was having with some fellow travelers around if the revolution had been betrayed by its leadership, that would implicate the families of Maduro, his own son. That would implicate the popular sectors, that would implicate the military, that would implicate all these actors, right? And when you say the state has been completely subverted or has been characterized as a neo-colonial puppet state, you are also saying that these aspects of the state, of state power, are also neo-colonial. And I was wondering if you could, both of you could reflect on what is the nature of the Venezuelan state. You each kind of gestured to these different sectors and institutions that make up the state, but it's not an imperial state, right? And I think people think, this is where we kind of depart from our anarchist friends. Maybe they're not friends, I don't know, but our interlocutors about the nature of the state, because we live in an imperialist state, right? That is, it's reflective of class rule, right? Whereas the Bolivarian project is something very much different from that.
So basically, I think that when we talk about the Bolivarian process as a whole, or the Bolivarian Revolution, it is important to center that it's a revolution that centers, let's put it like this, it's a left movement, first nationalist, but with clear left inclinations, a movement that centers the issue of power after a relatively long period after the fall of the Soviet bloc, in which most movements and progressive organizations had decentered the issue of power. So Chavez comes onto the stage and he says, it's about taking power too. It's not just about imagining and in small spaces or amongst ourselves changing our world, but it's about changing, in this case, a country, a nation, with a long history of struggles like any other nation, but that are inserted into the current Bolivarian Revolution or the Bolivarian process. So the taking of inhabiting the state is important for the Bolivarian Revolution. And it's impossible to understand the Bolivarian Revolution and even communes without understanding the state. I do think that communes are central. As Chris said, they are the roadmap for socialism in Venezuela. And not only are they the roadmap, but they are also spaces of actually building new social relations in the present, right? So I do think that communes are fundamental to the Bolivarian Revolution. But if we think about communes, some folks, there has been a recent interest in communes, and specifically in Venezuelan communes in recent years, and that is welcome. But people oftentimes imagine communes as self-governments, as grassroots governments, detached from the rest of the national project, of the Bolivarian process, of the collective emancipation project of the Bolivarian Revolution. And it's an error, a tremendous error, to imagine that communes or the communal project could even exist in Venezuela without the state, which is inhabited by a government, which is a revolutionary government. I will not say that Venezuela's state is a revolutionary state per se. Chavez said it once and again. The state is still a bourgeois state. I believe that the character of the Venezuelan state is, to a certain degree, still a bourgeois state, inhabited by a revolutionary government, but the government that in itself, of course, is composed of different tendencies, like any government, and like any revolutionary government too. So first, when we think about the state, it's fundamental to be clear that we have to maintain it. No, we cannot say, oh well, there's been these problems, so let's go on doing our thing on our own. No, we are certain that if the Bolivarian process loses its inhabitants of the space of the state, the communal project, which maybe we can talk a little bit more about later, but the communal project will be finished. Not that we will not have learned, not that there will not be revolutionary organizations, but we can be certain that without our capacity to inhabit the state, the project itself, as we know it, these spaces of building new social relations will actually disappear. So I think that that's basically important, and the people of Venezuela understand this. Why is there unity, and why has there been unity for 27 years when the government has actually made errors at times? The government has made large errors. I'm not talking about recently. I'm talking throughout the 27-year history. The government has made important errors, serious errors for me, between 2018, 2019, 2020, in the worst of the U.S. blockade against the people of Venezuela. The government entered a pragmatic process in which it had no interest in the communal project, which from our perspective is kind of like the reserve and the core of the future of Venezuela. So for a period of time, the government had no interest. And in fact, there were some frictions between the communal movement and the government. This happened, and the government corrected it. But even while that was happening, there was no organization, no grassroots organization, no Chavista organization, no commune that made a rupture with the government, because it is understood that the main enemy is U.S. imperialism, and that we have to stay united, and that our problems, which there are, have to be solved from within. And the extraordinary thing about that specific moment in history is that the government actually corrected. And it corrected because communes continued doing their work and were able to show that there was a capacity to not only solve problems, which was very important at that time, but also to generate esprit de corps, kind of like the capacity to go on fighting, and all that made the government correct and turn back towards the communes. The government understood that the communes is where the masses, the Chavista masses are, where they were building and are building a new world, and corrected, did a self-critique, not an open self-critique. And right now, since beginning to 2022, 2023, there has been a remerging of communes and the government. There was never a rupture, but there were spaces that were operating on different, not necessarily in an intercommunicated manner. And now there's a reemergence in that sense. So yes, I think that would be a long and disorganized reflection about the state and the popular movement, the dialectical relationship, and the relationship which can be tense at times, but has never been a rupture, and a rupture is not coming now either.
Sure, I completely agree with Cira about the perspective on the state and the centrality that, beginning with Chavez, was put on the state, recovering, I would say, a Leninist idea of the centrality of state power. Many people during the course of the Bolivarian Revolution asked whether Chavez was Marxist or not. In some sense, it's not even a necessary question, because every national liberation process since 1917 has essentially adopted de facto Marxist principles in terms of, especially in the anti-imperialist area. And so Chavez was going through with those principles. But I wanted to bring it up to date because Maduro also did this. I think part of this idea is not only taking power, but also maintaining it, maintaining power at every price, really. That's Venezuelan Leninism. I would say that's the Venezuelan updating of, or Venezuelan realization of Leninism, which is that you just maintain political power. You make the concessions, you hang on to political power because it's absolutely necessary. And we often point to looking back at the eras of Zapatismo as one of the historical lessons that Chavismo learned from. But I think you can also say that Chavismo learned from the eras of Sandinismo, when Sandinismo gave up power in a similar situation when there was a new imperialist surge, essentially with the demise of the Soviet Union. Imperialism felt empowered, and Daniel Ortega made what perhaps seemed like a good idea, that he would go to elections that he turned out losing, and then step out of power and come back. And I think he came back, he did manage to come back, but it's kind of, some people would almost say, a shadow of his former self. I continue to think Nicaragua is an important part of Latin America progressive forces. But it's certainly true that when a government goes out of power, a progressive government goes out of power, as the case with Lula or with the case of Daniel Ortega, they come back weaker, in a weaker position. So Chavismo learned from that. The most important thing is to maintain political control. We think of the revolution, I think of the way that you enter the state as introducing Cira refers to a bourgeois state. It's certainly a state that's organized previously by capitalism, and you can't just change it with a magic wand, but you can introduce a command center, a revolutionary command center into that state. And that's what establishes a dialectical relationship with the popular movement that will make the revolution go forward. And so it's important to maintain that command center. And I think that's how Venezuela is confronting the current situation, which is to make important, unfortunate, difficult concessions, but maintain political control, which means control of the party, control of the army. And in that situation, once you have that political control, the revolution can survive and navigate difficult territory, as the Chinese did, as Cuba has done in different situations. And it's like, if you maintain your command center within the state, you can recover lost ground in the future and successfully carry out an important reorientation.
Yeah, there are two sort of concepts that I wanted to ask you both about in the context of this process and this current moment. The first one is sovereignty, and we've been talking about this, the erosion of Venezuelan sovereignty, or perhaps, as it's been framed, the compromises of sovereignty. Cira pointed out about how the Venezuelan oil revenues are being placed into a U.S. Treasury account. More recently, Delcy Rodriguez was in India, and Marco Rubio kind of announced that her itinerary, kind of suggesting that, I think this is a quote, is that, quote, this is Marco Rubio, we want to sell India as much energy as they'll buy. We also think there's opportunities with Venezuelan oil. In fact, it's my understanding that the interim president of Venezuela will be traveling to India next week as well. Sort of suggesting that the U.S. State Department is sort of controlling the itinerary, the international diplomacy, the trade agreements that are being made with American allies. But then also there is the question of Alex Saab and his arrest at the hands of the United States, but also the sort of handing over of Alex Saab to U.S. authorities. And then on top of that, there was also, I'm just reading, I have a list of things that the media has reported on here. The military operation, I think it was a medical evacuation operation that was being staged in Caracas at the U.S. Embassy. There's also been public messages that were given out by the Rodriguez administration or their Twitter account denouncing actions on Iran. And I think I just wanted to maybe get your comments on this, because the next question I want to go to is this other concept of irreversibility. But if we could talk about how or if Venezuelan sovereignty has been eroded or compromised in this current situation.
Well, I think that there's no question that Venezuela's sovereignty has been eroded by the imperialist attack, and all those elements that you mentioned are evidence, indeed, of that erosion. Now, I think that we could go to the Iran case is actually a good one to take here as a teaching moment. This happened. This was a very unfortunate communique by the Ministry of External Relations that basically, after the attack on Iran and its defense. So that is the kind of action that people should be aware of and criticize. And people criticized it, and immediately the government took down the communique. So that is a moment where you can actually see how there is an active relation between the people and the government. Actually, my organization put out when the attack on Iran happened. My organization put out a communique of course, with the people of Iran, with the revolution, and so other organizations did the same. The government put out its communique, and then they took it down because of clear criticism from the bases. We will see more mistakes too, and there sure have been other mistakes other than that one, which I have no doubt it was a mistake. Fidel always said the revolution has the right to make mistakes, and I think that that's actually important to remember here. And a revolution that is in such an intense siege and a situation of attack from U.S. imperialism may make some mistakes, and we think and we hope that we will collectively correct them. So I think that that would be my reading. Of course, the Alex Saab case. I think that it's an interesting case which we take up in a recent article, because as it turns out, many people in many intellectuals and solidarity activists too, not only intellectuals, but solidarity activists have actually a very limited, and this is something that we've been learning recently, have actually a very limited practice. And perhaps one of the only practices that many solidarity activists had was in the Free Alex Saab campaign when he was held in the United States. I think there might have been errors. I mean, there are errors on the people on the left when there's limited practice. A practice is really what helps you understand the complexity, the contradictions, and to be able to make correct decisions, right? So I think that there was an error, a general error on the part of the global North left and even activists of really having a very limited practice. There was also an error of the Bolivarian process to prop Saab in the earlier period as a tremendous revolutionary. Now, it cannot be, it's actually a blow to Venezuela's sovereignty too, or an expression of the blows to Venezuela's sovereignty that Venezuela had to give him up. There are reasons to lock him up. And ideally, the correct thing would be to lock him up here, to have a trial, and so on. The conditions for that were not there. He was delivered to the US, and this was painful for all of us. Now, I think that the fact that many solidarity activists and left people had this very limited practice, and maybe their only practice was actually with the Free Alex Saab campaign, that's why they thought that this was the breaking moment. And I can assure you that here in Venezuela, among the Chavista bases, there could be some concern about the fact that he was delivered to the United States, but there were no ruptures because of this particular situation. So that would be just to take a couple of cases to understand that, first to recognize that, yes, there has been a blow to the conventional form of sovereignty that we understand. But there's another element, there's another key to sovereignty, which is popular sovereignty, which is what we see in the communes, and there hasn't been a blow to that sovereignty, or again, as Chris was saying, to the party. There haven't been intrusions in terms of the party organization, the party structure, and so on and so forth. Let's pass it on to Chris.
Sure, I wanted to say something about the question of oil and sovereignty. Like, essentially, if you say that this is if you look at a country of the global south, an important part of any country's sovereignty will be its economy. And historically, what Venezuela has sought through theoretical and practical developments is to have sovereignty over the oil. But it's not exactly sovereignty if you can't sell it. In other words, like over the last 100 years, the main client under Chavez, under everybody over the last 100 years, with the main client of Venezuelan oil because of proximity has been the United States. And the historical exception is the 5 years when Trump's first presidency, where he tightened up the oil blockade and really stopped sales to the United States. So I think that it's important to keep that in mind, because sovereignty for Venezuela would be having a viable economy that it controls. It's not exactly ideal sovereignty if you can't sell the oil. In other words, that's the situation where we put in beginning about 5 years ago, and then really tightened up over the past two or 3 months. So we could sit on the oil reserve and starve. I'm not sure if that's the best understanding of economic sovereignty. So this solution, which is now the United States controls the oil sales, but it is being sold, that's certainly not ideal. And some people could say it's a Pyrrhic victory. It's a Pyrrhic overcoming of the blockade. Nevertheless, in some sense, it is an overcoming of the blockade, because now the oil is being sold and we're getting returns on it. It's certainly not ideal, but I think it's important to keep the larger perspective, which is the sovereignty of Venezuela, the sovereignty of its oil, of its economy, is not going to be achieved by our inability to sell it, by simply sitting on top of the oil and not being able to sell it, which is what the United States insisted on doing with the other alternative the United States imposed on us. I certainly believe that the communique, which the Cira pointed out, was made to come down by popular pressure about Iran, was an error. On the other hand, it's not an error that's completely out of what people consider to be revolutionary in the revolutionary sphere. About a month ago, Hamas offered, of course, approved of Iran's attacking Israel, but they questioned Iran's attacks on the Gulf states. Now, I think that perhaps Hamas was being wrong about that too. We all consider Hamas to be the most important force in Palestine, the most heroic force in Palestine confronting Israel. the reason they probably did that because of their historic connections with the Islamic Brotherhood, which has an important role in many of the Gulf states, especially Qatar. So our error is not totally out of the sphere of this kind of error of like questioning. I think that if you understand Iran's situation, they have to attack the Gulf states because the U.S. bases are there, because the Gulf states in great measure collaborate with the United States, and some of them collaborate even with Zionism. So it's necessary for Iran to attack them. Nevertheless, Hamas took the occasion to question some of Iran's attacks on the Gulf states. So I just want to say that I think in both cases it shouldn't be done, but we're not totally out of the revolutionary ballpark by entering in that area. Now, I think the Venezuelan communique was worse than the Hamas one because Venezuela actually questioned Iran's complete response, not just a part of it. But as Cira says, this is an error, and it was responded through popular pressure. With the Alex Saab thing too, I completely agree with Cira that it was a mistake. That I believe it's very likely that Alex Saab was a double agent, but in that case, he should have been tried here. But again, this is an error. It's not totally foreign to that kind of error is not totally foreign to the Venezuelan situation. Chavez himself deported a Colombian revolutionary, Joaquin Perez Becerra, to Colombia, which at that time was a complete ally of the United States. And that was also an error. Chavez had to virtually admit that he'd made an error. So these are errors, but it's kind of a double standard if we hold Venezuela to be the only country that can't commit errors, which is why I point out these parallel examples.
Thanks for those comments, especially on the question of sovereignty. I want to move to this other question of irreversibility. There are gains that the revolution has made that I think I've heard both of you in different forums suggest that are irreversible. And maybe we could talk about what those gains are and put them into the context of this current moment, because you're talking about these institutions that still remain intact, right? But there are other processes that you can't just, that haven't been undone, and probably if they were attempted to be undone might provoke some kind of response. And I wanted both of you to just elaborate more on those questions, or on that question or that concept of the irreversible gains of the revolution in this moment.
So I think that to understand this concept of irreversibility, and Chris will go deeper into it, but István Mészáros, the Hungarian philosopher, somebody who influenced greatly Chavez, and who actually visited Venezuela on several occasions and met with Chavez, and they had very long conversations. He develops this idea of irreversibility, that in popular revolutionary processes, there is a collective learning that cannot be undone overnight, that actually stays there. So I think that I can go to some examples of how I see, as somebody who's part of a commune, of El Panal commune, as somebody who's part of the grassroots and a popular educator too, in a commune. I think I can, and also a researcher with Chris on communes. We have published more than 10 books here in Venezuela on different communal experiences. So I want to go over a little bit about the learning that it implies that the Bolivarian Revolution has brought. Oftentimes, the Bolivarian Revolution is told as many, like conventional history, even from the left, when the story of the revolution is told as follows. Chavez comes to power. There's the Constituent Assembly. Then there's referendum revocatorio. There's elections. There's coup attempts. There's the coup. There's coup attempts, and so on. A series of events that can be given a date, and that is the left kind of oftentimes reproduces this history, and I reproduce it too myself when I tell the story of the Bolivarian Revolution sometimes. But really, to understand the history, the story, the history of the Bolivarian Revolution, one has to also center popular participation. And I think that there's an important red thread within the Bolivarian Revolution, which would actually go back to 1991 when Chavez writes a text that's called the Blue Book, where he talks about participative and protagonistic democracy, to later, of course, the election of Chavez, the por ahora, the election of Chavez, more importantly, the constituent process where people, came and participated in the making of the Constitution. We came to Venezuela 20 years ago, and that was a few years after the constituent process. And I remember that people would show you the Constitution then, which everybody carried and still carries. And they would say, I wrote this article here in the Constitution with great pride. But so there was that process, but there were processes such as the mesas técnicas de agua, the technical water tables, and urban land committees, and taking of land by landless campesinos. And all these processes are processes that center the assembly, are centered around the assembly. People debating and figuring out how to solve the problems they have. Of course, with a particularity in the Venezuelan case after 1999 was that the government was in favor of the people, right? So there was a connection and a relationship between the government and the people meeting in assemblies. But assemblies are spaces for debate and the deliberation, spaces where contradictions emerge, spaces where you have to solve contradictions, of course, not antagonic contradictions, because communes are spaces of the working class. Formally, you can have a commune anywhere, but working communes are within working class barrios, neighborhoods, are in the countryside. So assemblies, an assembly of campesinos figuring out how to take the land, an assembly in the barrio figuring out how to get water to your house, and later assemblies in the barrios to make communal councils are communes. In communes, for instance, in the communes that have means of production, it's decided collectively in an assembly what to do with the surplus of the means of production. All these spaces of popular construction, of popular participation are spaces of learning. And I argued in an article that you cannot unlearn all the people of Venezuela and their government, which has participated in these processes too. The people of Venezuela cannot unlearn all this stuff. And that's why, as Chris was saying early on, the whole idea of treason is so absurd, because for there to be treason, everybody from those millions of people who have participated in very long, sometimes tedious, oftentimes tedious, very difficult, sometimes assemblies, would be treacherous together with the government and the leadership, and that is absurd. The revolution cannot be understood as such. So those are that idea of irreversibility of mesados, which frankly, when it was talked about for the first time, I thought it was a little bit odd, right? When Chavez began to use the term of irreversibility around 2007, 2008, 2009, I thought, wow, this seems a little bit, I had my doubts about it. But having been at it for so many years with the people, having been at it for so many years, I do think that there's truth to the concept. It is a category that is useful, a revolutionary category that is useful to understand what is currently happening in Venezuela. And I'll pass it on to Chris.
Sure. The concept of irreversibility, one way of understanding it is that Mesaros talked about capitalism or as not just a mode of production, but also a social metabolism. He called it the metabolism of capital. So the idea of a metabolism be something more capillary that enters into society. And that's why he put emphasis on creating a different metabolism, which would be a democratically controlled metabolism, so democratic control of production, maybe democratic control of communities more generally, which is where the commune comes in, which is political democratic control, economic democracy, but also social control over your region. So that's this idea of introducing a new metabolism is closely connected to the idea of irreversibility. And just to make it a little bit more concrete, I mean, just the most obvious things, like one thing is arms. It's notorious, like Venezuela is an armed people, and there has been important attempts to and realities of giving arms over to the people, specifically through the militias. So the militias number about 4 million people. And that is an important element of irreversibility, because everyone knows that if you have your people that are armed, it's going to be very hard to take power away from them. But also, as Cira was saying, a pedagogic sense. Chavez, if people remember him correctly, talked all the time. He would talk generally 4 to 6 hours every Sunday and sometimes midweek. And I one time did the calculation that if you put all those, publish it all, it would be like 80 volumes, roughly equivalent to the complete work of Lenin. And so we all sat around and we listened to him because he was very interesting, not only because he was intelligent, but also because of a certain kind of honesty, or the honesty of saying something and then doing it. So if you wanted to know what your future was going to be, then you listen to Chavez, unlike most politicians who what they say doesn't really connect with reality. So I guess Chavez, you could say he really did praxis, theory and practice together. And that made it very interesting. So when Cira says that can't be unlearned, I mean, that's a reality that people here have lived through that and come to have established that connection to leadership, come to have a sense of the leadership's responsibility. And that's another thing that's very, very hard to undo. I think that if you look at the question of irreversibility, to not make it abstract and just look at reality, look at any revolution. A very, difficult, a hard case is the Soviet Union, which did collapse in some sense in 1991, but not entirely. In fact, in spite of all the shock therapy they applied, in spite of the essentially genocidal practices the West tried to apply on the Soviet Union, on post-Soviet Russia, still Russia remains in some measure a delinked power and still of anti-imperialist force right now. So even in the most difficult case, maybe the worst case, that revolution has not been completely undone. But if you look at another case, a case that I consider very interesting and relevant to Venezuela, which is China. So the reforms in China happen essentially after the Cultural Revolution. And many people, this is of course a highly debated theme, but many people think that China just tried to turn the page on the Cultural Revolution. But in fact, I think if you talk to people in China and serious scholars, they'll realize that about the Cultural Revolution, that it achieved important things that are still present in Chinese society. Namely, people considering themselves protagonists, considering that the government is responsible to them. A friend of ours who's Chinese and actually critical of the Chinese government says that in the rural areas, China is the most democratic society in the world. And so there's an important sense in which that one of the most revolutionary moments in Chinese history is still present in China. It's still part of the current project. Xi Jinping still uses what he calls the mass line to make decisions. The mass line isn't consulting the masses. Now it's done through a electronic, using online technology. So there's an important sense in which if you look at almost every revolution, even the revolutions that have been dealt the most difficult blows, for example, Algeria, it's not true that the Algerian Revolution has been wiped from the map. The Algerian Revolution still survives in important levels of sovereignty and important levels of autonomous decision-making, willingness to confront Europe on certain points. So I think that if you look at the history of revolutions, this idea of irreversibility, which is not an absolute but an important force, is still relevant. So that's when I say that people should recognize there is a revolution here, and they should consider that when they can as something to be grappled with, a reason why it can't easily be betrayed, it can't easily be reversed, and you really have to apply the thumb screws. You'd have to apply shock treatment, essentially genocidal practices, to erase that revolution from the map here.
I want to say something very quickly, which is that I'm also looking at some of the comments from comrades on the side, and this brings something up about the current. It is actually striking that the situation, the way that Venezuela is being treated is kind of like as either as a very sick body that's a lost case, kind of like desahuciado, we say in Spanish, somebody who's just, like on their final days, or as a corpse that has to be dissected. And that's in many intellectuals are treating Venezuela like that. Like it's striking because, of course, Venezuela needs help. Of course, things are not easy. I have no problem with people criticizing. I mean, I'm sure the government has no problem with people abroad criticizing certain things. And certainly the government is not close to hearing criticisms from within, which should be the central ones that the government has to listen to. But to me, it's really, truly, truly amazing that all these people are saying, betrayal, and they only look at actions from certain actions from the government and not at other actions from the government. They take at face value everything that Trump says about Venezuela, when everybody knows that that Trump is the biggest liar. Whatever he says about Venezuela is said to be a fact about our current situation, and it's not considered part of the psyops. And ultimately, I think that this takes us back to the collectively learned processes, what has been collectively learned. I think that when we talk about what has been collectively learned, or this category of irreversibility, I think that folks really should be thinking that that's not for sure that we will win. That the people of Venezuela are the ones who have to define when this is lost, and not the people in the global north, and that this cannot be treated, this revolution or these people, as a body to be examined and to find why exactly of the many tumors that this body has, what's going to truly finish it. It's absurd. It's actually very, very, I think it's a very neo-colonial treatment of the people of Venezuela, what is being projected from certain intellectuals in the global north.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. And I think this gets into one of the questions I was asked in the chat about the potential oil shipments to Cuba and the restarting of those. But my question was, how has this process potentially, or how has it harmed Venezuela's relations, or how has it changed Venezuela's relations, specifically with governments like Cuba, but also I think Iran? The last time I was there, I remember there were Iranian grocery stores being built. And I think this is one of the areas that the United States is focused on, sort of severing those relations. So I don't know if either of you have thoughts on that.
Well, about Cuba, unfortunately, Venezuela for now is not going to be able to send shipments to Cuba. Venezuela does not have the capacity to commercialize its own oil. It's not a Venezuelan decision. It's a reality imposed by absolute brutal military force from the United States. The relationship between the Cuban government and the Venezuelan government, I mean, there have been meetings back and forth, and there haven't been ruptures. There's all sorts of fake news. Like, for instance, a couple of days ago, there was a fake news that all the Cuban doctors in Venezuela had left Venezuela, and that's just not true. They haven't left Venezuela. The truth is that for the last 7 years or 8 years, there's been many fewer Cuban doctors in Venezuela for several reasons. One is that the Cuban doctors trained Venezuelan doctors, which was always the idea. Another reason is the blockade, which made it difficult to maintain many of the Cubans who were here, to maintain them here. But there hasn't been a return. There are still Cubans, specifically in the medical and educational sector, that are here, and they haven't left. Somebody was asking about the 32 Cubans, since we are talking about Cuba, and I think that Cuba always deserves to be centered, and especially right now that it is under so much pressure and this genocidal attack from U.S. imperialism. The 32 Cubans died defending President Maduro, and they are in the heart of every Venezuelan, specifically of every Chavista. But I think that many non-Chavistas too really feel the Cuban people very close, and a great deal of gratitude and also pain. We feel pain for our own dead, but also uh, a lot. We feel pain, but also a great deal of gratitude to the people of Cuba for having been defending our president at that time. So that's with Cuba, the relation continues. I think that the relationship with Iran is. This is pure speculation. I think the relation with Iran is not very active at the moment. Venezuela's relation with Iran was specifically centered. I mean, of course, two anti-imperialist revolutions, so that's what brings them together. But the specifically active uh, part of Venezuela's relationship with Iran was also based on oil. We got the diluents from Iran, and Iran got Venezuelan crude that has stopped. So it's not so. I know for a fact, even if it hasn't been told to me, that the relation is not so active at the moment, unfortunately. And these relations, I mean, we are 5 months away from the attack. I think these relations do have to be activated. I mean, those are things that are pending tasks of the Bolivarian Revolution, to ensure that after the like the disorganization and reorganization that has followed January 3rd, there have to be many. We have to make a long list of tasks to make sure that uh, through the pragmatic but necessary steps that have to be taken, that we don't lose the closeness with our allies, who are of course the peoples of the world who struggle against imperialism. And right now, Iran, the Iranian Revolution, is in the center of and is in the vanguard of the struggle against U.S. imperialism and Zionism.
Sure. I see in the chat a lot of people are saying that they're asking, is Venezuela a colony of the U.S.? And some are saying, accusing Venezuela of being a colony. And I think that I think there's a huge double standard that people should step back and think about. Like many of the people who actually say that kind of thing, for example, they rightly celebrate the government of Gustavo Petro in Colombia. I say that's an important progressive government in the region, but remember that Colombia has 7 military bases in it. Does that make Colombia a U.S. colony? I don't think those terms are to just kind of like to no one would. I don't think anyone would say that, and it would be historically false. Another case would be the case of Cuba after 1898. So Cuban independence is 1898, and there was very difficult situation imposed on the Cuban revolutionaries because the United States essentially intervened and put in the Platt Amendment, which restricted Cuban sovereignty. Nevertheless, Cuba was not a colony of the United States. People tend to think because of the gloriousness of the Cuban Revolution of 1959, they tend to erase the long history of struggle. The Cuban Revolution of 1959 is a product of 100 years of struggle. Fidel always mentioned that. He always said it's a revolution inspired by Jose Marti. It's inspired by the Mambis. An important step of that revolution was the independence in 1898, led by nobody less than Jose Marti, in which the results were not complete sovereignty, but they were an important step. And Cuba ceased to be a colony in spite of the limitations imposed by the Platt Amendment on Cuba. So it's kind of like erasing history, applying a very crude lens, which will hinder our struggles. Because if you don't understand that what was done in 1898 in Cuba, in spite of its limitations, provided the platform for the revolution, you can't even understand the difference between Cuba and Puerto Rico. It was a strong sense of Cuban sovereignty the sense of what the Cuban people were, what they achieved in 1898, that became the platform through an ongoing struggle in the early part of the 20th century that culminated in the Cuban Revolution. So if you just say, well, okay, Venezuela's a colony, party's over, that's really hamstringing any revolutionary project. And that's why I always think, as Cira said, it's a neo-colonial attitude. I do think there's an element of projection going on. People, unfortunately, this concept of Gabriel Raquel talks about a intellectual labor aristocracy. So just like there can be a labor aristocracy in the imperialist core, workers that are, because of imperial drain of value, workers that end up locating themselves on the side of imperialism. That can also, and probably happens with even greater frequency among intellectuals. In that case, I think intellectuals manifest their actual interest in defeating anti-colonial projects because their actual interest on the side of imperialism. And sometimes I think these crude categories, these willingness to dismiss the Venezuelan revolution, this apparent desire to say the party's over, is an expression of those class interests of the intellectual labor aristocracy.
I agree. Actually, I have his book right there behind me. Gabriel Raquel's book. It's sitting right behind me. And I actually put this on the screen because I thought it was a very poignant comment from one of the listeners. I'll just read it. I don't know how to read their name. I apologize. Looks like it's an auto-generated name. The workers in imperialist countries never experienced trusting workers close or far. They only experienced trusting the orders from their bosses. And what I take this comment to mean is that, we are indoctrinated to not trust the oppressed. Like we don't even trust ourselves, right? And when we do, and when I see these narratives being repeated, it is repeating the narrative of the bosses, those who rule the world, the Trump administration. And I remember for me, this became very acute during the 2019 coup in Bolivia. I was actually in Caracas when this happened. And I remember seeing David Checowenca, who was at the time the Secretary General of ALBA in Caracas. And, he had actually invited me to a summer solstice ceremony in La Paz, but I never made it, obviously, because the coup was underway. But what was fascinating in that moment was the severe denunciation of Evo Morales as a traitor to the revolution, a traitor to Bolivia, a traitor to indigenous people. The New York Times even ran an article accusing him of genocide. It was fascinating. It was like absurd. Like looking back on it now, it's completely absurd. But I think, hopefully we will be able to look back on this moment in time and make, similar sort of observations. But I strongly agree with what both of you have, what both of you have said in terms of the chauvinism within the imperial sort of intellectual class. And the sad thing about it is that many of these the people in this imperial or this intellectual class are coming from countries who are being subjugated by the United States itself. It's this common experience. I think as somebody who's an indigenous person, I'm one of the rare people who's actually from the land whose land that we're actually on, and I can see it. It's very apparent to me, right? But we also have, we also are subjugated, nations within. We are oppressed nationalities within, and I feel like I think it was in one of the interviews that you had done on the Resistance is Fertile podcast. I actually wrote it down and I checked the book out from the library. It's called The Affirmative Action Empire, and I started going back and reading this, and it's just such a wake up call, and it really, I think, exposes some of the contradictions and the inability. And I actually wrote this down. I put it on a Post-it card, Cira, after you said it. It says, in that podcast interview, you said the U.S. Revolution hasn't started. And I always want to remind people that, we haven't put our skin in the game, so to speak. We don't have the experience. I mean, we do have moments of rupture, but we don't have our skin in the game in this moment in time. We can't even stop our own government. Not only can we not get healthcare, not only can we not get just basic, things. Like I was trying to tell people here, I was like, yeah, when I was in Venezuela, when I was in Bolivar, the electoral process, they had the ballots in, several different indigenous languages. We don't even have that as a normative, thing in the United States. And people will dismiss it as like liberal identity politics. They'll dismiss it as, as a sort of recognition. It doesn't translate into material change, without recognizing that those ballots in indigenous language, somebody fought for that. Somebody died for that, probably. Somebody gave their life to have those things and to have dignity that's immeasurable. You can't put a price tag on that, right? To have dignity, to be spoken to in your own language. And I was where I'm going with this is, to kind of round out this discussion. There's two aspects. One, I want to finish talking about this idea of a revolutionary intellectual. What is our responsibility if we identify as anti-imperialist intellectuals, or as people, left intellectuals, or perhaps revolutionary intellectuals? What is our obligation in this moment in time? And I think, sadly, the United States and the imperial core is very lacking, right? We saw the really horrific hypocrisy of intellectuals such as, Noam Chomsky being aligned with, the Epstein class, and we tend not to have the kind of real life heroes, right, that a lot of these revolutionary movements have. We just have the Avengers and the Marvel comics, right? All of our heroes are make believe, sadly. We do actually have heroes. We're kind of fighting an information war. I don't want to dismiss those traditions of resistance, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on what it means to be, a revolutionary intellectual. Both of you had said you're part of a commune. What does it mean to be a popular educator? And what are our responsibilities of that intellectual to these mass movements?
Of course, to be revolutionary intellectual will have to come with some sort of practice, which can be something as simple as, I don't know, in the global north, it may just be working in a community kitchen or something like that. I think that you can, if you do not have a practice, you will not have the tools to understand contradictions. You might learn about them from Hegel or something, but you will not have actually the learned tools to analyze a real life situation. So I guess that would be one of the keys from my perspective. In my case, I am part of Banal Commune. I'm a popular educator at it's called the Pluriversidad, the University of the Commune, and that is key for me. And also having been a teacher for many years at the Bolivarian University, of course, teaching with working among the working class is also a practice. And it's one thing to study or teach in an elite university, and it's another thing altogether to teach and work with working class people. So I think that all those practices are the practices that have helped me. I cannot generalize. I can't generalize in terms of what being a revolutionary intellectual takes, which is some sort of practice. And also kind of like really being on the ground and listening to the people. And that is easier when you have an actual practice. So those would be in terms of the current situation of being a revolutionary, not of what is being a revolutionary intellectual, but of being a revolutionary intellectual right now in relation to the Venezuelan case. I think it's first and foremost, people have to listen to the people here in Venezuela. And of course, not everybody's here in Venezuela. Not very few people will have the chance to hear what people in Venezuela, but it is possible to know what the people are thinking in Venezuela, because if there were ruptures, you would see communiques, and you will right now see communiques with some. It's likely that if you begin to look online, you will see communiques with some critical perspective, but communiques of rupture you will not find I promise that you will not find from the grassroots that really exists in Venezuela, that being not only communes, but also other revolutionary organizations, except that the ones that already made the rupture before the actual attack on the 3rd, and you will see communiques, critical communiques and rupture communiques from those people who already made a rupture. So ultimately, it's about the praxis, it's about listening to the people, it's about understanding that the role of an intellectual has to be a humble role. It cannot be being above it all and deciding by oneself in some sort of tower what is right and what is wrong. That is necessarily going to lead to the wrong conclusions. All this is kind of like this historical position in which intellectuals have put themselves, of being in the tower and deciding from up there what is right and what is wrong, when something is alive and when something is dead, is actually incremented by the social media personality or influencer logic, which the influencer does not only follow that logic, but also has to be taking decisions all the time about everything. And if they don't do that, if they don't say what is right and what is wrong, this yes, this no, and make a short statement about it in terms of their so-called decision, they'll disappear. They are over. They are done. So that situation fits onto the influencer situation, fits onto more conventional, traditional intellectuals who are also feeling right now this urge to decide with tremendous urgency about what's happening here in Venezuela. Look, I mean, really, it's been 5 months. It's really of 27 years. And as you said, of, like more than 500 years of a struggle, the last 27 years of the Bolivarian Revolution, 5 months in which important and very difficult concessions have been made, but in which the people have not given up on their government. But, like so little time. If people have doubts and big doubts, why don't they just wait a little bit? It just amazes me. It's just like, hold on. Why do you have to make a decision about Venezuela? I understand people having doubts. I'm not saying that people cannot have doubts, but it's just like, who are you and why so quickly? Why do you have, this overwhelming? Why do you want to overwhelm all the people of Venezuela with privileged internet that you have and with privileged social media that you have? These intellectuals and social media personalities overwhelmed millions of Venezuela, which can be done. Really, a few intellectuals and influencers can actually overwhelm millions of Chavista Venezuelans, and that shouldn't be done. So just take a break. Give us a break. Just give us some time.
Sure. I wanted to say something about the idea of an organic intellectual. I think so. This is a term that was invented, as far as I know, by Gramsci, and he opposed organic intellectuals with traditional intellectuals. An organic intellectual is an intellectual who has a relationship to a movement, and that's many. Like an organic intellectual can be a great figure, like Lenin. People forget that Lenin and Luxemburg were actually organic intellectuals because they were actually involved in movements, and Lenin wrote probably something every day, it seems like, but it was in relation to a movement, and actually changed his views often on different positions, trying to be true to that movement. So I think that's what people should try to be, as an organic intellectual. A good example of Lenin, I don't mean to contribute to hagiography, making a saint out of Lenin, but a very interesting moment in Lenin is at the end of State and Revolution. The last chapter doesn't exist because he says, will be better. I'm not going to write this because I need to go do the revolution. How many people are in that situation today? Cira's talking about these, I call them free-floating intellectuals, using a term from Karl Mannheim, and Karl Mannheim, I don't know much about his sociology, but I think he saw it as positive. But the free-floating condition has become the universal one right now, and it's mostly negative. So how many of the intellectuals today who even consider themselves, the wide swathe of intellectuals, it's good they consider themselves Marxist. The amount of people who consider themselves Marxist and anti-imperialists after the 2008 crisis has increased. But how many of those people would ever find themselves in a situation like Lenin where they have to say, okay, I'm going to stop writing the book because I need to go do the revolution, and that's more important. It also has to do with this attitude that, the aim is to be right. The aim is to prove other people are wrong. But if you're involved in any serious revolution, you will have to carry out a process of self-critique. You will inevitably make errors. A revolution by its, Cira refers to praxis, and a revolution by its very nature, everything won't be clear from the beginning. And that means people will make mistakes during the course of a revolution. So the only aim is to be true to the revolution. That's why in this current situation, I consider myself in the minority. I think many of us here, we consider ourselves in the global minority because we're not protecting our reputations. We don't really care about our reputations. What we want is the revolution to go forward. So I find that many people ask us to podcasts or ask us to contribute, or people send us a WhatsApp message. They want to know what's really going on in Venezuela, or how can we understand Venezuela? And I always think the first instance, I hope that their premise, but I'm not sure that's always the case. I hope their premise is how can we help the Venezuelan revolution, not how can we understand it. Of course, to help it, you have to understand it. That's true. But I think it should always be kept in view. It's like U.S. imperialism is carrying out a war against us. It's an act of war to put a country under a naval blockade. It's an act of war to steal its president. So we're at war with them. So in a war, the question is how you can win, and that should be kept in the foreground all the time. So, and it's more or less a global situation where the U.S. imperialism has taken on this exterminist, recolonizing character. So we're at war with them. The question is how we can defeat them, how we can eradicate, have a victory over that enemy. Sometimes I feel that the people adopt through inertia and intellectual laziness this kind of free-floating attitude independent of what their real class interests are. So I want to make a plug for being an organic intellectual, and that's just not a question of willpower. I mean, you can say it's not a question of standing in front of the mirror and saying, I'm going to be an organic intellectual. It actually means you have to find yourself socially, connected to something. There's actual work, physical work, intellectual and physical organizing work to find yourself in a condition where you will have a loyalty to some kind of emancipatory process in the first instance.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And to sort of elaborate the Gramscian concept of an intellectual, organic intellectuals are often produced by the industry or the mode of production or their function within society. So like we do have like capitalist organic intellectuals. I think Cira pointed this out very poignantly about the influencer. I would say it learns how to use the algorithms. Learns how to make their voice stand out. There's all attention is good attention, whether it's negative or positive attention. And I think what Gramsci was really saying too is that taking those organic intellectuals among the working classes, among the proletariat or the peasantry, and transforming them into merging them with a revolutionary structure, organization to form the new intellectual, right? That is, taking their experience from their class position and elaborating it into, not just how to improve their position as a class, but actually how to fundamentally change society. And so I really appreciate your thoughts on that. And it gets into my sort of final question and discussion around your own, both of your work, your scholarship, your reporting in Venezuela. You have a series called Shaking the World, Reports from Revolutionary Venezuela, which is through Monthly Review Online or mronline.org. And one of the more recent dispatches that you did was titled Between Heaven and Hell, Life in the Orinoco Delta. And this you go into a Waro indigenous community and begin to sort of talk about not just talking about people's experience, but you also have this interesting concept of understanding the sort of blockade that indigenous people have been undergoing, even without sort of U.S. sanctions. And I was wondering if you both could reflect on not only what you learned from these indigenous-run communes or these the indigenous process of the revolution and its participation, but also how these reports that you're doing, the Shaking the World reports, sort of contribute to those of us in the North, or those of us in the imperial core, better understanding the revolutionary process, not necessarily from top down, but from bottom up.
So indeed, there's this column in which we published the article on the Guarao community between heaven and hell. There is a long-term project which is called Communal Resistance. If you go to Chris's website, which is chrisgilbert.site, you will be able to download the work on actually books in Spanish and published in kind of like specific deliveries or segments in English. So you will find all that work there. Specifically, this piece, most of our work with communes, or a great deal of our work with communes, is testimonial work. And this actually goes back to Gramsci too, like generally people think of commune arts as people who are solving their problems and maybe thinking about how to make a better life. But of course, commune arts are intellectuals, and actually they are every person is an intellectual as per Gramsci, and commune arts are intellectuals with a great deal of experience, and therefore with a great deal of capacity to analyze their situation. So I think that people could go there to find some of that work, testimonial work. But this piece is, we recently were in Delta Macuro, in the delta of the Orinoco River, visiting Guarao communities. And there's several things that are important about the piece, not about the piece, but about what we learned. One is something that you actually brought to the forefront early on in your experience with Venezuela, that indigenous people feel very much part of the Bolivarian Revolution. When you go to an indigenous community, be it in the ones that we have been to, I cannot talk for all of them, but the several indigenous communities that we have been to in Amazonas state, in Delta Macuro, and in other states, the first thing that they actually want to talk to you is about the Constitution too, how the Constitution, how they exist in the Constitution, and how, in terms of what that implications it has in terms of their schooling, of their voice. A Guarao leader talked about how they sing the anthem in Guarao language in our visit, and she sang it, and she was very moved to it. It was very moving for us. So there is a sense of participation within the national project, but also a sense of having a project that has its own autonomy, which is fundamental in this case. But going beyond those reivindications that are very uniform in all of our experiences of visits to indigenous communities, what was very much a learning moment for us is that in these communities, they actually lived a genocide, a Nakba, in the year 65, because there was it was the building of a road and closing of a caño of one of the streams of the river that generated an ecocide, and thousands of people died and thousands of people were displaced. In principle, it wasn't organized in terms of genocide, but it had to be clear that it was going to generate a great amount of death amongst these communities. So we pick up on their story of making, which is the story of the Guarao people, of their coming to the earth, from heaven to the earth, because the earth has all these rivers and all these birds and all these plants, and we go from there to kind of like drawing a parallelism with a current situation, which we see it's a situation between heaven and hell, where heaven is the self-organized forms that are actually very robust, still common tenure of the land, common decision making amongst these communities, common living amongst these communities, therefore communal living in all these communities, but also the hell imposed by colonialism and imposed by US imperialism. So indeed, the situation that indigenous communities have been living for a long time is very similar to the situation that the Venezuelan people have lived for the last 10 years, in the sense that there is a tremendous forms of economic, social, political violence exercised against them, but specifically the economic impact of colonization is large, as is the economic impact of the U.S. blockade on the people of Venezuela. So that was a recent visit from which we learned a lot, and we will. This is just a little bit of a reflection, but there will be a book coming from this visit about the different communes in the voice of the communards, as we always do, listening to them and learning from them about the reflections on communes, specifically on their communal life, which is not the product of the Bolivarian Revolution, but rather the Bolivarian Revolution is a product of their communal forms of living.
I wanted to say something about the just a little bit on a somewhat more abstract level about indigenous rights and indigenous struggles here in relation to the revolution. I think there's often, everyone knows that the NGO world has done its work, and sometimes with certain forms of post-colonial, decolonial theory, they often lead people to believe that the state is your enemy, and that and they want you to focus on everything except for the state. There's real reasons related to funding, or even more, even very problematic objectives sometimes in that. But what the Bolivarian Revolution shows, and it's not, it's a simple matter, as Cira was pointing to the Constitution, that by actually taking state power and changing the Constitution, indigenous people in Venezuela have a qualitatively qualitatively improved situation. And everywhere you go, that's the starting point of any conversation with indigenous people here. They always recognize that there was a qualitative leap once the revolution came in, took state power, and developed a constitution that recognized them as people. So that's an important learned lesson, not only of the Bolivarian Revolution, but also of the Soviet Revolution of 1917. There was a huge effort made to bring, to this affirmative action towards non-Russian peoples within the Soviet Union. Is actually an achievement of the Stalin period, essentially. And so that kind of shows the importance of how, to me, that shows an important lesson, which is that Marxism and indigenous struggles are not opposed to each other. It's a kind of win-win situation where both can benefit from the other, because the essentially Marxist Leninist idea is taking state power, and from state power making revolutionary changes. And those revolutionary changes in the history, of course with failures, of course with all kinds of problems, but it's a qualitatively different situation when from the state you can construct a plurinational, multi-ethnic society and actually carry out significant changes. So that's the starting point here. Of course, there's all these situations. We compared the situation in the Delta Macuro to a kind of blockade, and we interestingly discovered that much of the language, or much of many of the concepts that indigenous people, the Warao people there, apply, like something like subversive complicity, or as a way of confronting the overall relation to Creole society, replicate some of the attitudes, or strategic retreat or tactical retreat are some of the attitudes towards the Creole society. Some of those are the same as we're applying towards imperialism. So it's not an easy situation, but I think that everything points to the essential compatibility between a Marxist and Leninist inspired revolution. I say that in the case of de facto, because Bolivarian Revolution is not explicitly that way, but a de facto Marxist perspective in which you take state power, change the constitutional nature, open up to a multi-ethnic, multinational state. That's a qualitatively improved situation from which indigenous people have a new platform to struggle.
Yeah, thanks so much for those perspectives. I dropped the link to that piece in the chat. We also linked to the books that you both have published, co-edited and authored. I will say that one of the more profound experiences that I had in my conversations with some Pemon comrades, it was about medicinal plant medicine and the training of community. I guess I'm trying to think of an English translation: community health representatives, or community health representatives. People who aren't necessarily trained as doctors, but maybe have like a nursing sort of equivalent, are trained in a dual medicine approach, one that incorporates the Western science, but also indigenous knowledge. And there's a certification program that happens alongside that. And then there was also, for a time being, an indigenous university in Caracas. But there's just all these advances that were sort of made. And I think when we think about U.S. sanctions or imperialist intervention, I think even I want to say in one of the charging documents against Maduro, the accusation that the district attorney made against Maduro was that he was also oppressing indigenous people. And I think it was in specifically the mining arc region. But I think how indigenous struggles begin or get sort of co-opted within these imperialist narratives of like a humanitarian intervention, without recognizing that U.S. Sanctions, they affect everybody, society writ large, and sometimes more vulnerable aspects of a society are made more vulnerable by those sanctions. And I always just kind of keep that in mind, like that it's not just reversing the Bolivarian process, it's also attempting to reverse, I should say, or stall or overthrow the struggle for indigenous people, indigenous rights. And I would say that speaking of irreversibility, a lot of that, nobody wants to go back to 50 years, 50 years ago. Nobody wants to go back in that sense. And so I think just thinking about everything that we've talked about and thinking about it in the sort of diverse array. I know both of you have written quite extensively on the experience of the communes, and that's actually where I first heard the Waru national anthem, and the language was at a Caracas commune. There's these indigenous children who sang that for us when we came to visit, and it was quite fascinating. I'll end with this kind of anecdote, because the commune itself, they built their own housing. They were building their own garden. And we asked them about the struggles, and of course they had this larger anti-imperialist critique, and they're very supportive of Maduro at the time, but their struggles were kind of fascinating. They talked about how they were just managing the living situation, like the conversations that they had to have, the meetings, and there was an individual who was using drugs, and how dealing with that, you don't call the police, you deal with it as a community, and what that meant, and like that to them was power, right? Being able to build their own houses, have their own homes, but also to have autonomy and self-determination about their social relations. Whereas in, a place like the United States, if something like that happens, people call the police, this person gets picked up, maybe they get shot, maybe they get beat up. We don't know. It's privatized. It's not socialized, right? So they were really trying to implore us to think about how do we socialize these issues rather than privatize them or turn them into sort of moral defects that deserve, some kind of punishment. I thought that was just a really sort of empowering, experience visiting and in talking with people about what they thought as like the pressing issues in their own commune versus like what we may think of as issues, or don't think of as issues, or take for granted as issues. So I want to respect both of your time, and I just really appreciate you both taking time today to talk to me. And I want to have you on, but I also want to strongly suggest that our listeners and our viewers check out your website. Those links are in the chat, but also the MR Online series that you're both writing for the column. And before we end it, I just want to maybe ask both of you to kind of give maybe some final thoughts, but also where good sources of news that you recommend that people look at, trusted news sources, but also anything that you want to uplift in this moment.
Thank you again, Nick, and to everybody who has been listening. I do know that it takes patience to go back through all these details to try to understand better the Bolivarian Revolution at this difficult juncture. So, of course, to everybody who's listening, I guess the main thing is that not that Venezuela should be the center of folks who are listening to us, probably mostly in North America. Not that Venezuela should be the center, but if Venezuela is a concern, I think there might be some places in addition to the column on MR Online. There is also Orinoco Tribune, which also reports a fair amount on Venezuela, although not exclusively on Venezuela. I think those would be kind of like resources that are useful. That then I guess I would make a call to try to folks who speak Spanish, and even if right now translators are not that difficult, try to get a sense of what what the Chavista bases are saying and thinking. And that's not necessarily easy because the Chavista bases are not they are not public figures. They are not influencers, generally speaking, but like there will be communiques every so often coming from communes, from popular organizations that will be interesting to be reading. Those will come out in Spanish, and to the degree that people can want to know better what's going on. Communiques from communes would be a good place to get a sense of what people are thinking. In general, I do make a call for people to give Venezuela the Bolivarian Revolution time to really. I mean, so oftentimes people ask us, but what is Delcy's strategy? I mean, first of all, I don't know if I don't know. I wouldn't know if there's a fully drawn out strategy at the moment. I'm sure that there's a strategy in the short term, but it cannot be asked of the Bolivarian Revolution to have a fully formed strategy in terms of how to come out of the situation immediately and right now. I think that we are still developing a strategy. So give some time to the people of Venezuela, and to its government to figure it out. I can assure that the people of Venezuela do not want to enter a situation of neocolonialism, and the government does not either. So you can count on the people of Venezuela doing everything we can. And because it didn't begin yesterday, but it began 27 years ago, I think that there should be trust in that the people of Venezuela and their government will be able to correct whatever needs to be corrected and to develop a full strategy, which probably for now it doesn't exist. There's not a fully developed strategy in terms of how to deal with the current situation at the moment. This strategy, by the way, will have to be built not only within Venezuela, but it will have to be a continental Latin American and Caribbean strategy, specifically in the first instance, a Latin American strategy. We do have a big pending task. Not only is Venezuela in a very difficult situation, all of Latin America is in a very difficult situation. So for us to develop a fully effective anti-imperialist strategy, it cannot be done only from Venezuela. It has to be done collectively.
Sure. Just want to add something to that. I was thinking about the Chinese case, the reform and opening that was done in 1978. I mean, I think that the proof that was the right decision, they made the right decisions, only became evident about 30 years after the fact. So I think we need to, as Cira was saying, slow down the timescales. I agree with her completely that the strategy is not going to drop down from the sky. There's the Chinese saying that you cross the river by feeling the stones, and that's kind of what the Chinese applied in that moment. In other words, muddling your way through certain situations, determining what works. And I think the same thing here. We won't really know, one won't really be able to say with any certainty that we did the right thing or our strategy was the right thing for 10 or 15 years. So that's why patience is of the order. And I also think, going back to some things we said earlier, that in that space of uncertainty, everyone likes the simple narrative, but the situation can't be reducible to a simple narrative. So in that space of uncertainty, people should think not just understanding the Bolivarian Revolution or the Latin American Revolution in general, or the revolution of the global South, not just trying to understand it, but thinking how you can help it. So considering considering the first instance, for example, what you will say, how that will affect it. Those are basic ideas. In other words, what will my stance, what I say, what I write, well, how will that help things go forward in this what's truly a space of uncertainty? But what's not uncertain is the objective. The objective is very clear. And I don't think that this is certainly a bad moment in the sense that I think you could say that this new fascist recolonizing imperialism has won the first battle. For sure, it's won the first battle. But it also is indeed weaker. It's gone for the military option because it's weaker in other areas. So there's possibilities for us. Although they can make these military advances, I think essentially they're in a weaker situation. So even if they won the first battle, I think future battles can be won on our side. And I think the war can be won on our side.
And I have one last question to folks who are saying that everything is over and that there has been treason or that the revolution is over. And this goes back to something that I think we were saying perhaps before we actually were live. What is the actual point? I mean, really, what happens from saying this is to the degree that when folks say that the revolution is over, what the implication of it ultimately, if this gets to the people of Venezuela, is demoralization. I mean, the only, other than saying I was right, as an intellectual, look, I was right, or I am right, whatever, I'm the one who has the truth. In addition to that, which is pretty obvious and mediocre, the other immediate effect is demoralization. What is the point of demoralizing a people who have just 5 months ago been attacked for 27 years, but in a very brutal military way, only 5 months ago? There's absolutely no point. It's just extremely cruel. It's not only false, it's also cruel. Like from a human perspective, like it's just sheer cruelty. And I think that people have to, give us some time. Will we succeed or will we not? I don't know. Revolutions, oftentimes, historically, revolutions have been then dealt blows, and some of them have been able to survive and others not. So I do not have a glass ball. I don't know what will happen here, but I know that we are still in the struggle. That is a struggle worth fighting, and all I ask is that people continue to trust that the people of Venezuela are probably on the right path, are on the right path right now, and will probably succeed.
Yeah, just some final thoughts on that. I remember watching Telesur the day after the kidnapping of Maduro, and they were interviewing people on the street, as they often do. And this one Chavista, she was saying, this is a demonstration of weakness on behalf of the U.S. empire. This is what this is their last option. They couldn't defeat us politically, socially. Their ideas don't win, right? Their ideas don't win in the realm, so they have to resort to military, kinetic power, because that's a demonstration of weakness. And I was reminded as you both were talking about that because that really sticks in my mind. She's like, it shows you how strong our revolution is actually, because it's the only way that they think they can defeat us. And I hope that gives us hope and humility, I think, is what, as academics are as we like to do, they want to invent a new term or whatever. Why don't you invent revolutionary humility and start practicing it in this moment? Anyways, I thank you both, Chris and Cira, for joining us. And everyone in the chat and who are watching, thank you for commenting. And we will hopefully have you on soon again.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Venceremos.